My name is Josephine Sinclair. I'm 35 years old. And until this past Christmas, I hadn't sat at my mother's dining table in exactly 5 years, 3 months, and 11 days. A length of time I know precisely because I had spent nearly every one of those days building toward the 20 minutes that would finally, completely, end whatever remained of my family's ability to pretend nothing had happened. "You may come to Christmas this year," my mother, Alina, told me over the phone in late November, her voice carrying the particular graciousness of someone who believed she was extending forgiveness rather than negotiating terms. "But there are 3 conditions." I sat very still at my kitchen table, phone pressed to my ear, and told her I was listening. "First," she said, "I would need to apologize to the family in person for the accusations I had made 5 years earlier. Second, I would need to sign a document formally releasing any further claims against the Sinclair Family Trust, the same trust our grandfather had established for all 3 of his grandchildren before he died. Third, and she delivered this one with the specific delicacy of someone who had rehearsed exactly how to make an insulting request sound like a reasonable one, I would need to bring a meaningful financial contribution toward the holiday, something that demonstrated, in her words, that I still valued being part of this family. I told her I would meet all 3 conditions. I want you to understand, before I tell you what actually happened at that dinner table, that I meant every word of that promise, and that meeting her conditions quietly, without argument, without a single raised voice over the following 3 weeks, was the most strategically important decision I made in this entire 5-year story. Before I tell you exactly what was inside the envelope I handed my mother in front of 11 relatives on Christmas Day, and what happened when she opened it, tell me what time it is where you are right now and where you're watching this from. I want to know how far tonight's story travels. For the past 6 years, I had worked as a fiduciary compliance investigator for my state's Department of Financial Institutions, a job that involved examining trusts, estates, and guardianship accounts for evidence of mismanagement, self-dealing, or outright theft by the people entrusted to manage money on behalf of someone else, usually elderly beneficiaries, minors, or family members who had, for one reason or another, placed their financial well-being in someone else's hands. My job existed because trust, in the legal sense as much as the emotional one, requires verification precisely because the people most capable of betraying it are the ones closest enough to the money to know exactly how to hide what they've taken. I had grown genuinely good at my work over those 6 years, developing an instinct for the specific pattern of small, defensible withdrawals that, added together across enough years, quietly hollow out an account that looks, on any single statement, entirely unremarkable. I did not fully understand, when I accepted that job at 29, that I would eventually apply every skill it taught me to my own family's finances, or that doing so would cost me 5 years of holidays with people who had once been the entire center of my life. My grandfather, Walter Sinclair, had built a modest but genuinely successful chain of hardware stores across 3 counties before he retired, and had established, roughly a decade before his death, an irrevocable trust intended to provide for his 3 grandchildren, myself, my sister Camille, and my brother Theo, structured to distribute funds gradually as we reached certain milestones, a portion at 25, a larger portion at 35, and the remainder at 45. With our parents, Alina and Douglas, appointed as co-trustees responsible for managing the funds and making distributions according to the trust's terms, until each of us reached the qualifying ages ourselves. I turned 25 9 years ago and received my first scheduled distribution without incident, a modest but meaningful sum that helped me put a down payment on my first apartment. I did not think much about the trust again until 5.5 years ago, when a routine professional training on detecting self-dealing in family trust structures happened to use, as one of its hypothetical case studies, a pattern of transactions so similar to something I vaguely remembered my mother mentioning about the Sinclair Family Trust that I found myself, almost against my own will, requesting a formal accounting of the trust's activity that same week. What I found, once the accounting finally arrived after several delays, my mother characterized at the time as simple administrative slowness, made my hands unsteady in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar, given how routinely I reviewed exactly this kind of document professionally. Over the preceding 8 years, my parents, as co-trustees, had authorized a series of loans from the trust to themselves, each one modest enough on its own, 4,000 here, 6,000 there, always documented with a promissory note promising repayment, always never actually repaid according to any record the accounting could produce. Added together, those loans totaled just under $140,000, an amount that, under the trust's own terms, should have been earning interest for the beneficiaries, myself, Camille, and Theo, rather than quietly funding what I would eventually learn included a kitchen renovation, 2 family vacations, and most painfully, a substantial contribution toward the down payment on a house purchased for Theo, my younger brother, 3 years earlier. Presented to the entire family at the time as a generous gift from our parents, rather than what the trust documents actually revealed it to be, money drawn against an inheritance that belonged equally to all 3 of us. I confronted my parents about the accounting during a family dinner 5.5 years ago, calmly, I believed at the time, laying out the numbers and asking simply for an explanation and a realistic repayment plan. My mother's response was not the explanation I had hoped for. She told me I had always been the difficult one, the child who turned every family gesture into an accusation, and that questioning how she and my father managed money that had, in her words, always really belonged to the family as a whole rather than to 3 separate individuals, was a betrayal of everything they had sacrificed to raise us. My father, Douglas, said very little that night, the way he said very little during most conflicts, deferring entirely to my mother's version of events even when, I suspected even then, some part of him understood the numbers didn't actually support her framing. Camille, my older sister, sided with my parents immediately and completely, accusing me of being obsessed with money in a way that embarrassed the entire family. An accusation I found particularly difficult to absorb given that Camille herself had received. I would later confirm through the same accounting, nearly $30,000 in undocumented transfers from the trust over roughly the same period, money she never once acknowledged during that entire conversation. I left that dinner and did not return to a single family gathering for the following 5 years, 3 months, and 11 days. I want to be honest that those years were not simply a period of righteous waiting. They were genuinely difficult, filled with the specific, compounding grief of missing birthdays, missing my niece's first steps, missing the ordinary accumulation of small family moments that, once missed, cannot ever quite be recovered even if the underlying conflict eventually resolves. I spent much of that time in therapy, working through the particular guilt of being labeled, by my own family, as the difficult one for the singular offense of asking a fiduciary to account for money that legally belonged, in part, to me. But I also spent that time doing something I had never fully admitted to anyone outside my own legal counsel, until the moment I finally handed my mother that envelope, methodically, patiently, and entirely through proper legal channels, building a case. Roughly 2 years into the estrangement, my Aunt Susan, my mother's sister, attempted to broker a reconciliation, inviting me to lunch under the guise of simply catching up, then spending most of the meal gently suggesting that perhaps I had let pride keep me from a family that genuinely wanted me back, that surely whatever misunderstanding had occurred could be resolved if I simply extended an olive branch first. I remember sitting across from her, wanting badly to believe her framing, wanting even more badly to simply say yes, and let 5 years of documentation dissolve into a comfortable, mutual forgetting. I asked her, carefully, whether she knew the actual reason I had stopped attending family gatherings. She admitted she only knew what my mother had told her, that I had become fixated on some old business dispute over Grandpa Walter's trust, and had let it consume my relationship with the entire family. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that I appreciated her wanting to help, but that reconciliation built on a story that wasn't true would only ever produce a temporary peace, and that I wasn't willing to trade the actual truth for a version of family harmony that required me to pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. She left that lunch, I believe, still mostly unconvinced, and our relationship remained politely distant for the following 3 years. A small, specific loss among the larger one that I still think about more than I probably should. 18 months after that initial confrontation, once it became clear my parents had no intention of voluntarily repaying the misappropriated funds or even acknowledging, beyond vague deflection, that a problem existed, I retained a trust litigation attorney named Priscilla Nkemelu, who specialized in exactly this kind of family fiduciary dispute, and filed a formal petition with the probate court requesting an accounting audit and the appointment of an independent trustee to replace my parents, citing the pattern of undocumented loans and self-dealing the professional accounting had already revealed. I did not pursue this petition to punish my parents, though I understand, given everything that followed, how difficult that claim might be to believe. I pursued it because Theo, at the time, was only 23, still 2 years from his own first scheduled distribution, and because I understood, professionally, that trusts left in the hands of trustees who have already demonstrated a pattern of self-dealing rarely correct themselves without external intervention, regardless of how many family dinners are spent promising otherwise. I remember, distinctly, my first meeting with Priscilla, sitting across from her in a small conference room lined with case files, laying out the accounting documents and asking her, almost apologetically, whether pursuing this formally was an overreaction to what might, after all, simply be a family that managed money more casually than I was professionally trained to accept. Priscilla listened to my entire explanation without interrupting, then slid the accounting summary back across the table toward me. "Josephine," she said, "if this exact pattern crossed your desk professionally, $140,000 in undocumented, unrepaid loans from co-trustees to themselves, spanning nearly a decade, would you call that casual money management, or would you call it exactly what your training tells you to call it?" I told her I would call it a clear breach of fiduciary duty, the same words I had used in professional reports dozens of times before. "Then that's what it is here too," she said. "The fact that the trustees happen to be your parents doesn't change the legal analysis. It only changes how much it hurts to apply it." That conversation reframed something for me that I hadn't fully allowed myself to consider, that my hesitation wasn't actually uncertainty about the facts, but grief anticipating what pursuing them honestly would cost me. Priscilla warned me, that same afternoon, that litigation like this typically took years rather than months, that my parents would likely contest it rather than negotiate, and that I needed to decide, clearly and in advance, whether I was prepared to lose years of ordinary family contact in exchange for a resolution that might not restore anything emotionally, even once it concluded legally. I told her I understood, and I want to be honest that I did not fully, not until I actually lived through every one of those years she was warning me about. The court process moved with the particular grinding slowness that characterizes most probate litigation, extended further by my parents' decision to contest the petition rather than negotiate, retaining an attorney of their own who argued, across nearly 2 years of filings, that the loans in question represented reasonable trustee discretion rather than misappropriation, and that my petition was motivated by personal animus rather than genuine concern for the trust's integrity. I want to note, because I think it matters, that I never once, during those 2 years, discussed the litigation with Camille or Theo directly, choosing instead to let the court process unfold through proper channels rather than turning family gatherings, which I was no longer attending anyway, into battlegrounds over evidence that would eventually speak for itself far more effectively than any argument I could make at a dinner table. Theo, I would later learn, genuinely did not know the full extent of what the accounting had revealed, having accepted, the way people often accept comfortable explanations from parents they trust, that the down payment on his house had simply been a generous gift rather than money drawn improperly against a shared inheritance. The court ultimately ruled, just over 3 years after I filed the initial petition, ordering a full forensic accounting of the trust's activity going back to its establishment, confirming the pattern of undocumented, unrepaid loans totaling, once every transaction was properly traced, closer to $183,000 once accumulated interest the trust should have earned was factored into the calculation. The court found sufficient evidence of breach of fiduciary duty to remove my parents as co-trustees entirely, appointing an independent professional trustee, a fiduciary services firm with no personal connection to our family, to manage the trust's remaining assets and oversee a structured repayment plan requiring my parents to restore the misappropriated funds, with interest, over a court-supervised schedule. This ruling had been finalized nearly 14 months before that phone call in late November, sitting quietly, known only to me, my attorney, and the court itself, because I had made a deliberate choice. Once the ruling arrived, not to announce it, not to call my parents, not to send a single triumphant message to anyone in my family. I simply waited, understanding, in a way I could not have fully articulated even to myself at the time, that the ruling would matter more, land more completely, if it arrived at a moment my family had chosen themselves rather than one I forced upon them. I remember exactly where I was when Priscilla called to tell me the ruling had come through, standing in my kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday evening, halfway through making dinner for one, the same small, solitary routine that had defined most of my evenings for the previous 3 years. I set down the knife I was using and sat down slowly at the same kitchen table where months later I would take my mother's phone call about the 3 conditions. I did not feel triumphant hearing the ruling, though I had, in quieter moments over the preceding years, imagined I might. I felt, mostly, a strange, hollow kind of vindication, the specific loneliness of being proven completely right about something you had desperately hoped. Some small part of you might turn out to be a misunderstanding after all. I called no one that night. I did not call Camille, did not call Theo, did not even call my closest friend, Renata, until nearly a week later, because some part of me needed to simply sit with the ruling privately first, to let it exist as a fact in my own life before I let it become anything else. A weapon, a vindication, a headline for anyone else's version of this story. I remember thinking, sitting at that table with the knife still resting on the cutting board and the pasta water slowly going cold on the stove, that winning a legal case you never wanted to file in the first place doesn't actually feel like winning. It just finally feels like being believed, 4 years too late, by an institution instead of the family who should have believed you first. When my mother called in November with her 3 conditions, framing an invitation back into the family as something I needed to earn through apology, renunciation, and financial contribution, I understood immediately that she had no idea the court ruling existed. My attorney had ensured that formal notification of the final order had been sent to my parents' last known address, satisfying every legal requirement, but Priscilla had warned me, based on her experience with similar cases, that co-trustees removed for cause sometimes simply avoided opening or acknowledging court correspondence for months, a form of denial that delayed the emotional reckoning even after the legal one had already concluded. My mother's 3 conditions, I realized. Listening to her explain them with such careful, gracious authority, were being issued by a woman who still believed she controlled the terms of this entire relationship, unaware that a court had already stripped her of the specific authority she was currently trying to leverage against me. I agreed to all 3 conditions without argument, and spent the following 3 weeks meeting each one with a precision that, I understand now, must have seemed to my mother like genuine capitulation. I wrote and delivered, during a carefully scheduled phone call 2 weeks before Christmas, an apology that was, on close reading, remarkably specific in what it actually addressed. I apologized for the pain the past 5 years had caused the family, for the holidays we had missed together, for the distance that had grown between us. I did not apologize for the accusations themselves, because I had learned, both professionally and through 5 years of careful reflection, that a document produced under someone else's power still cannot demand you apologize for the truth. My mother, listening to that apology, heard what she wanted to hear, and did not notice, or chose not to notice, the specific absence of any retraction. I signed the release document she sent regarding future claims against the trust, a document Priscilla reviewed beforehand and confirmed was, at this point, essentially meaningless, since the court's final order had already established the repayment schedule and independent oversight going forward. meaning my mother's release document addressed a version of the trust's future that no longer legally existed. And for my financial contribution to the holiday, I offered to cover the full cost of catering for Christmas dinner, a genuinely generous gesture that cost me just over $1,100, and that I made deliberately as a demonstration that whatever came next was never actually about money for me, regardless of how much money the entire conflict had originally involved. Camille called me during that same 3-week window, roughly a week before Christmas, her tone carrying a mixture of cautious warmth and something more guarded underneath it. She told me she was glad I was finally coming back, that the family had missed me, though she said it in a way that still, even then, carried a faint undertone of blame, as though my absence had been a choice made in isolation rather than a response to something specific that had happened to me. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she hoped I understood how much stress the past 5 years had put on our mother, and that she hoped I would be, in her words, gracious about letting the past stay in the past once I arrived. I told her carefully that I intended to come to Christmas with an open heart, which was true, and left it at that, unwilling to reveal anything about the court ruling before I was ready, but unwilling also to promise a version of gracious silence I already knew I wasn't going to deliver. Camille, sensing something slightly unresolved in my tone, asked whether I was still upset about the trust. I told her I was still processing a lot of things, an answer vague enough to be honest without being informative, and she let the subject drop, apparently satisfied that whatever remained unresolved between us would simply dissolve once we were all back together at the same table. I hung up that call feeling the particular, specific guilt of allowing someone I loved to walk toward a moment I already knew was going to hurt her. A guilt that did not change my decision, but that I carried with me for the remaining week regardless. Christmas Day arrived, and I drove to my parents' house for the first time in over 5 years, carrying a bottle of wine, a tray of the caramel apple pie I used to make every year before everything fell apart, and a single sealed envelope tucked inside my coat pocket. The house looked almost exactly as I remembered it, the same wreath on the door, the same over-decorated tree visible through the front window, and walking up that familiar driveway produced a specific, disorienting grief I hadn't fully prepared for, the grief of missing something even while actively, deliberately, walking back into the situation that had taken it from me in the first place. My mother greeted me at the door with genuine warmth, the kind of warmth that made it, for one brief and unsettling moment, almost possible to forget everything that had led to this particular reunion. Camille hugged me stiffly, still visibly uncertain how fully to trust this reconciliation. Theo, now 28, hugged me the way he used to when we were kids, without any of the careful calculation the rest of the family seemed to be managing, and told me, quietly, that he'd missed me more than he knew how to say. My father shook my hand rather than embracing me, the same emotional caution he had shown throughout most of my childhood, but told me he was glad I had come, and I believed, at least in that specific moment, that he meant it. Dinner proceeded through its familiar rhythms, the same dishes, the same slightly too loud conversation, the same specific chaos of 11 relatives crowded around a table meant comfortably for 8. My mother made a small toast partway through the meal, thanking everyone for gathering, mentioning, with a warmth that felt entirely genuine on the surface, how grateful she was that our family was finally whole again after such a difficult period. Several relatives raised their glasses. I raised mine as well, and waited until the toast concluded. The conversation began settling back into its ordinary rhythm, and dessert plates were beginning to circulate, before I reached into my coat pocket, still hanging on the back of my chair, and retrieved the envelope. "Mom," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me given how hard my heart was pounding beneath it. "I have something for you too. A gift, I suppose, though it's not really mine to give. It's just something you needed to see." I handed her the envelope across the table. She opened it with the same bright, expectant curiosity she'd have shown opening any Christmas gift, unaware, until the first page slid free, that she was holding a certified copy of a probate court order rather than anything resembling a holiday sentiment. I watched her expression change in real time, the warmth draining slowly first, Then all at once, as she read the caption at the top of the page, in the matter of the Sinclair Family Trust, and beneath it, the court's finding that Alina and Douglas Sinclair had breached their fiduciary duty as co-trustees, the order removing them from that role, the appointment of an independent trustee, and the schedule requiring repayment of $183,000 with interest. Over the following 6 years, the table went completely silent, the particular silence that arrives when 11 people simultaneously realize they've just watched something enormous happen and are still calculating what it actually means. My mother's hands were shaking, not the performative shaking of theater, but something involuntary and real as she flipped through the remaining pages, the forensic accounting summary, the schedule of undocumented loans stretching back nearly a decade, the specific line item, highlighted I noticed, though I had not highlighted it myself, showing the $84,000 drawn from the trust to fund Theo's house down payment. Theo, sitting beside her, leaned over to read what she was holding, and I watched his face change too. The slow, dawning understanding of a 28-year-old realizing the home he'd been living in for 3 years had been purchased, in part, with money that legally belonged equally to his 2 sisters. "What is this?" my mother finally said, her voice smaller than I had heard it in my entire life. "This is the court's final ruling," I told her, keeping my voice as calm and even as I could manage. "It was finalized 14 months ago. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to. I wanted you to invite me back into this family believing you still had leverage over me, because I needed to understand whether you actually wanted me here, or whether you only wanted me compliant." My father, who had said almost nothing throughout the entire meal, set down his fork very deliberately and asked, quietly, whether this meant the money would actually need to be repaid. I told him yes, that an independent trustee was already managing the repayment schedule, and that the court had structured it to avoid forcing the sale of the house, provided payments continued according to the approved timeline. Camille, who had been silent through most of the reveal, finally spoke, her voice tight with something between anger and disbelief. "You've been planning this for years. You let us believe you were finally coming back to the family. And this whole time you were just waiting to humiliate us at Christmas dinner." I told her, honestly, that I hadn't been waiting to humiliate anyone, that the ruling had existed for 14 months regardless of whether I chose to announce it at this dinner or through a certified letter mailed to the house, and that I had chosen this moment specifically because I wanted my family, for the first time in 5 years, to understand exactly what they had actually been asking me to apologize for and renounce. My Uncle Frank, my father's brother, who had always been closest to my father among his siblings, asked to see the document himself, reading through it slowly with his reading glasses pushed low on his nose. And when he finished, he looked at my father with an expression I had never seen pass between them in my entire life, something between disappointment and genuine grief. "Doug," he said quietly, "you let your own kids find out from a court filing instead of from you." My father had no response to that either, and I watched something in him seem to fold inward, a man confronting, in front of his own brother, exactly how completely he had chosen convenience over honesty for nearly a decade. My grandmother's old friend Ruth, who had known our family since before I was born and had been invited, as she was every year, as an honorary member of the extended table, quietly gathered her coat and told my mother she thought it best if she headed home. A small, wordless verdict that seemed to land harder on my mother than almost anything said directly to her that entire evening. My mother, recovering some of her composure, though considerably less of it than she'd carried into the dinner, asked whether I had done all of this, the therapy, the careful apology, the catering payment, the drive up that familiar driveway, purely as an elaborate strategy to embarrass her in front of the family. I told her the honest answer, which was more complicated than either of us probably wanted it to be in that moment. I told her I had genuinely wanted to come home for Christmas, had genuinely missed my brother, and, despite everything, still loved her and my father in the complicated, imperfect way you continue loving people who have hurt you badly. But I also told her that wanting to come home did not mean I was willing to sign a document renouncing claims to money that a court had already determined belonged, rightfully, to me and my siblings, and that the same document she had asked me to sign would have been, functionally, an attempt to have me waive rights that the court's ruling had already secured on my behalf 14 months earlier. "You asked me to apologize for accusations," I said. "The court already confirmed the accusations were true." "I couldn't apologize for that, Mom, no matter how badly I wanted to come home." The remainder of that Christmas dinner did not proceed the way any of us had planned when we sat down. Relatives who had traveled considerable distances for what they believed would be a straightforward, if slightly tense, family reunion instead found themselves witnessing the quiet, devastating unraveling of a story my parents had apparently maintained, in various forms, for over 5 years, that I had left the family over some vague, overblown misunderstanding, rather than a documented pattern of financial misconduct that a court had since formally confirmed. My Aunt Susan, my mother's own sister, asked, with visible shock, whether this meant Alina had actually stolen money that belonged to her own children. My mother had no answer that didn't further confirm exactly that. Theo left the table at one point, and I found him 20 minutes later sitting alone on the back porch, staring out at the yard where we had spent most of our childhood summers, the same yard where our grandfather used to grill on the 4th of July and tell long, meandering stories about building his first hardware store from nothing. "The house," he said, when I sat down beside him. "The one I've been so proud of, that I always told people Mom and Dad helped me buy because they believed in me." He didn't finish the sentence, and I understood he didn't need to. I told him, gently, that I didn't fault him for not knowing, that our parents had structured the story specifically so that none of us would ever compare notes clearly enough to see the full pattern, and that his gratitude toward them had been genuine even if the story underneath it wasn't. He asked whether he needed to pay back his share of the money directly to me and Camille. I told him no, that the trust's independent trustee would handle the full repayment structure, and that his obligation, if he felt one, was really to himself, to eventually understand exactly what our parents had actually given him and what it had actually cost the rest of us. Camille and I did not resolve anything that night, and our relationship in the months since has remained careful and considerably more distant than either of us would probably prefer if we were being honest with each other. She told me, weeks later, over a tense but genuine phone call, that she was still working through her own anger, not at me specifically anymore, but at having spent 5 years believing a version of our family's story that turned out to be almost entirely constructed to protect our parents rather than reflect what had actually happened. I told her I understood, and that I wasn't in any hurry to force a reconciliation neither of us was ready for. She has, since that call, begun requesting her own copies of the trust accounting, reviewing the $30,000 she received years earlier with a scrutiny she'd never previously applied to it. And I suspect, though we haven't discussed it directly, that she is beginning to understand her own complicated relationship to money our parents distributed selectively enough to keep each of us grateful rather than curious. My parents' repayment of the $183,000 continues under the independent trustee's supervision, structured over 6 years with interest, a schedule that has required them to sell a vacation property they'd owned for over a decade and adjust their retirement timeline considerably later than they had planned. I do not take satisfaction in watching my parents' retirement delayed by years, and I want to be honest that this entire process has never felt like victory in the way I imagine it might look from the outside. It has felt mostly like grief stretched out over years, the grief of understanding that people who raised you, who genuinely loved you in whatever imperfect way they were capable of, were also capable of quietly treating your inheritance as their own contingency fund, confident enough in your love for them that they assumed you would either never notice or never act even if you did. My father called me privately, about 2 months after that Christmas dinner, in a conversation considerably more honest than anything he'd said directly to me in years. He told me he had known about the loans, had participated in authorizing them, but had genuinely convinced himself, at the time, that the family would simply repay them informally before any of us ever needed to know, the way people convince themselves of things that are convenient rather than true. He said he was sorry, not the vague, gracious sorry my mother had offered over the phone in November, but something plainer and more specific, sorry that he had let convenience override what he knew, even then, was actually his and my mother's responsibility as trustees rather than an entitlement attached to being someone's parents. I told him I appreciated that apology more than he probably realized, and that I hoped, eventually, we could rebuild something real between us, built on honesty rather than the careful, curated warmth that had defined most of my childhood. Several months after that Christmas, once the initial shock had settled into something more like ordinary, complicated family life, Theo asked whether I would drive out with him to the site of our grandfather's original hardware store, long since sold and converted into a small regional bank branch, something neither of us had visited since we were children. We stood in the parking lot for a while, looking at a building that no longer resembled anything from our memory, and Theo told me he'd been thinking a lot lately about the stories Grandpa used to tell, about building something slowly, honestly, one true transaction at a time, and how strange it felt to realize that the inheritance Grandpa built specifically to protect us had instead become something we'd needed a court order to actually receive intact. I told him I thought Grandpa would have been proud of the outcome even if he would have hated the process, that the entire point of structuring the trust so carefully, with milestones and safeguards, had probably come from his own quiet awareness that money and family don't always protect each other automatically, that sometimes the protection has to be built deliberately, the way he'd built everything else in his life. Theo was quiet for a long moment, then said he wanted to name his and his wife's first child, due that spring, after our grandfather, regardless of anything that had happened with the house or the money. I told him I thought that was exactly right, that Grandpa's actual legacy had never really been the trust itself, but the son and grandchildren who eventually chose honesty over comfort when it mattered most, even 5 years and $183,000 too late. I still work as a fiduciary compliance investigator, and I think, now, more often than I used to, about how many families are quietly living inside exactly the version of my own story that existed before that Christmas dinner, trusting relatives who have learned to make dishonesty feel like generosity, and generosity feel like something that can never be questioned without threatening the entire relationship. I do not believe every family conflict over money reflects genuine wrongdoing, and I want to be careful not to suggest that documentation and legal caution should replace basic trust between people who love each other. But I do believe, having lived through 5 years of my own family's careful mythology, that love which requires you to stop noticing inconsistencies is not actually protecting the relationship. It is simply protecting whoever benefits from you not noticing. So here is the question I still find myself sitting with, months after that Christmas dinner, in a life that finally, after 5 years, includes a genuinely honest relationship with at least some of the people I grew up loving. If the people closest to you asked you to apologize for noticing something true, simply because the truth was inconvenient for them, would you have apologized anyway, the way I almost did, the way so many of us are trained to do, or would you have found the same quiet patience I eventually found? The patience to let the truth arrive on its own timeline instead of forcing it into a fight no one at the table was ready to have honestly. I would love to hear what you would have done in my place, whether you think I waited too long to reveal what I knew, or whether you understand why the timing mattered as much to me as the truth itself. Share your thoughts in the comments, because someone reading them tonight might need permission to trust their own careful documentation over a family's comfortable, convenient story. This video is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection. All names, characters, and events are fictional. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you enjoy stories about quiet strength, financial truth, and the kind of justice that doesn't need to shout to be heard, subscribe to Sweet Vindication, and we'll see you in the next one.